The city had not seen a sunrise without fear for nearly a year. Its walls, once symbols of unyielding strength, were now scarred by relentless assault, blackened by fire, and battered by siege engines that never slept. From the highest ramparts, the soldiers could see nothing but enemy encampments stretching endlessly across the horizon, a grim reminder that relief might never arrive. Hunger gnawed at them with the same persistence as the enemy's battering rams, and every day the line between survival and surrender blurred. They ate what little they could salvage, the leather of boots, the leaves from roof gardens even, rats that scuttled in terror along the streets. Disease festered in the crowded quarters, and morale was a fragile ember, kept alive only by duty, camaraderie, and the stubborn hope that the world outside had not abandoned them. Sieges had always been the cruelest of wars, testing not only military skill but human endurance, unlike battles where victory could be claimed in hours. A siege stretched the limits of time itself, turning patience into a weapon and starvation into a strategy. For those trapped within stone walls, days blurred into nights and weeks into months, each one a small victory against despair. Soldiers learned to navigate the delicate balance of rationing, scavenging, and conserving their strength, understanding that a single misstep could tip the fragile equilibrium between life and death. They became masters of improvisation, converting every available resource into sustenance or defense, their ingenuity matched only by their desperation. Yet the toll was not only physical. The mind, once focused and disciplined, became a battleground of its own. Fear of the encroaching enemy mingled with the terror of scarcity, and whispers of surrender, mutiny, or betrayal haunted the corridors. Some men fell to madness, wandering the ramparts as shadows of their former selves, while others clung with an almost fanatical resolve to the hope that relief would come. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and survival began to circulate. Legends whispered, even among the enemy lines, tales of soldiers who endured what seemed impossible, men who faced death daily yet refused to yield. The siege was as much a test of the city's infrastructure as it was of its warriors. Wells ran dry, granaries emptied faster than they could be replenished, and every stone of the wall had to serve multiple purposes: protection, shelter, even sometimes food. Engineers and officers became as critical as the soldiers themselves, devising secret channels, hidden cisterns, and defensive innovations that allowed the city to resist longer than logic would permit. Every decision carried immense weight. One miscalculation, one failure of leadership could turn a fortress of hope into a tomb of despair. And yet, amid the relentless struggle, there was a strange rhythm to survival. The city, though battered, persisted. The soldiers became more than men. They became symbols of endurance, their every act of defiance against hunger, disease, and the relentless enemy a testament to human resilience. Legends grew quietly in the shadow of suffering, stories that would outlive the very walls that contained them. For every soldier who fell, another learned to endure, to innovate, to survive. And in that endurance lay the true heart of the siege. This was a world where time itself became a weapon, and patience a matter of life and death. Here, history was written not in the flash of swords or the roar of cannons, but in the slow, grinding endurance of those who refused to surrender. Their story was one of agony and triumph, of despair and tenacity, a testament to the extremities of human will. These were the soldiers who survived year-long sieges, men trapped between the merciless forces of hunger and fear, yet whose courage would echo through the ages. Their ordeal was more than survival. It was a demonstration of the limits of human endurance and the thin line that separates legend from history in the shadow of collapsing walls. Amid the stench of decay and the constant whisper of death, they stood firm. They waited, endured, and adapted. Each day survived was a victory. Each night endured a quiet triumph. And as the world outside raged on, the stories of these men forgotten by many, immortalized by few, became the silent testimony of resilience, courage, and the unforgiving reality of war. The question remained, how did they do it? How did ordinary soldiers, trapped in extraordinary circumstances, endure the impossible for an entire year? Long before the age of cannons and gunpowder, long before the thunder of artillery shook the earth, cities were conceived as sanctuaries, walled havens meant to protect their inhabitants from marauders, rival kingdoms, and invading armies. Yet those same walls, towering and impenetrable as they might have seemed, often became prisons for the very people they were designed to protect. In the ancient world, the most potent weapon of war was not the sword, the spear, or even the chariot. It was hunger. Siege warfare was an art of patience and cruelty, a contest not of brute strength but of endurance. And its masters were the civilizations that first understood that to conquer a city, one must first starve it. Take Babylon, one of history's most resplendent metropolises. Its walls, vast and fortified, seemed insurmountable, yet invaders learned that the city's splendor could be its weakness. A besieging army needed not break the walls, but to isolate the city, cut it off from external supplies, and force the defenders into slow, inevitable starvation. Inside, soldiers were tasked with more than guarding the ramparts. They tilled what little land existed within the walls, planting crops on rooftops and in hidden courtyards, creating secret gardens to stretch the meager food stores. Granaries were precious, and every seed counted. Yet even these precautions could only delay the inevitable. The defenders became scavengers of their own homes, repurposing wood, animals, and sometimes even clothing to sustain life for another day. The human body was pushed to its absolute limits. Yet in this crucible of suffering, extraordinary resilience emerged. Troy, immortalized by Homer, offers another glimpse into these ancient trials. For years, its defenders held firm against the Greek coalition, the city's walls enduring wave after wave of assault. But the siege was not won through the clash of swords alone. It was a battle of logistics and patience. Soldiers, while stationed along the ramparts, were also engineers and scavengers, constantly repairing breaches, reinforcing gates, and searching for hidden caches of food. It was a delicate dance between fortification and famine, each side attempting to outlast the other. And yet, despite the heroism celebrated in epics, Troy's eventual fall demonstrated that even the strongest walls were powerless when isolation and starvation became weapons of war. Jerusalem, too, faced repeated sieges in its long and tumultuous history. During the Assyrian and Babylonian campaigns, defenders were forced to ration grain to near impossibility, sometimes surviving on what they could find in abandoned buildings or hidden. Soldiers were transformed into farmers and engineers, laboring tirelessly to dig wells and tunnels that might secure water when the city's main supplies were cut off. Their struggle was not simply to defend a wall, but to keep the city alive from within, to outlast an enemy who had chosen time rather than force as its instrument of conquest. Each day became a calculus of survival, a meticulous calculation of food, water, and human stamina, a grim testament to the harsh reality that starvation was often more deadly than any weapon forged in bronze or iron. The philosophy of siege warfare in this era was simple yet devastating. Take the city by taking its stomach. Armies that could maintain encirclement, deny access to essential resources, and endure the rigors of time often triumphed without ever breaching the walls. Siegecraft evolved as much through understanding logistics as through engineering or combat. Soldiers became versatile practitioners, equally adept at defending walls, tending gardens, digging wells, and rationing supplies. It was a multifaceted endurance test, a war waged not in minutes or hours, but in weeks and months, a psychological as well as physical struggle. But then everything began to change. As empires grew larger and more resource-rich, they could sustain massive armies outside cities for extended periods, transforming sieges from intermittent skirmishes into prolonged, systematic campaigns. Empires like Assyria and Persia developed the infrastructure to maintain siege camps for years, complete with supply chains, engineers, and siege engines capable of wearing down cities slowly but relentlessly. The defenders' ingenuity and endurance could delay the inevitable. Yet the might of these empires imposed a new reality. No city, no matter how well prepared, was truly safe from an enemy willing to wait, resupply, and strike again with patience, measured in years rather than days in this age. The soldier's role evolved from mere warrior to survivalist, engineer, and strategist. The walls of Babylon, Troy, and Jerusalem were not only a defensive barrier, but a stage for human ingenuity and perseverance, where every meal stretched thin, every repaired wall, and every secret tunnel became an act of defiance against time itself. They were not merely soldiers. They were witnesses to the unrelenting test of human endurance, participants in a form of warfare that demanded both courage and cunning in equal measure. And as empires rose, with resources sufficient to maintain armies indefinitely outside the gates, the ancient art of starvation wars would evolve, setting the stage for sieges that would endure not months but years, reshaping both the fate of cities and the course of history itself. The human cost was immense, the suffering unimaginable. Yet in these early sieges lay the foundation of all future endurance warfare. The strategies, the ingenuity, and the resilience of those soldiers became the blueprint for generations, proving that survival in a city under siege required more than strength. It demanded patience, innovation, and an almost inhuman capacity to endure the slow, gnawing advance of hunger and despair. In this crucible, the first legends of siege survival were forged, not through decisive battles or heroic charges, but through quiet, relentless endurance, the ability to withstand what seemed impossible day after day, month after month, until the very fabric of human will was tested to its limit. And so the stage was set for the next chapter in human warfare, where empires would wield time and logistics as weapons, challenging soldiers to endure in ways that would push the boundaries of courage, ingenuity, and survival far beyond anything the ancient warfare. Few civilizations mastered the art of siege as ruthlessly and methodically as Rome. While many empires relied on brute force or fleeting skirmishes to subdue their enemies, Rome perfected the long game, transforming siegecraft into both a science and a spectacle of psychological domination. The Roman military machine, disciplined and organized beyond anything previously seen, turned patience, logistics, and unyielding pressure into weapons as lethal as any legionary sword. For cities under Roman siege, the experience was as much about slow attrition and the manipulation of fear as it was about the clashing of armies. Masada, perched on its plateau in the Judean desert, became the epitome of Rome's relentless siege strategy. In 73 CE, a band of Jewish rebels, the Sicarii, took refuge in this seemingly impregnable fortress. The Romans, led by General Flavius Silva, surrounded the plateau, constructing an extensive network of walls, ramparts, and siege engines, transforming the area into an almost insurmountable trap. For the defenders, every sunrise brought the same grim reality. Roman forces were patient, precise, and equipped to wait as long as necessary. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Water became a precious commodity, and the defenders were forced to ration, scavenge, and innovate to survive. Soldiers and civilians alike cultivated whatever meager resources remained. Yet the encirclement was nearly total, and with each passing day, the psychological strain mounted. The Romans, masters of siege engineering, employed battering rams and constructed massive earthen ramps, slowly closing in, forcing the defenders to confront a fate that was inevitable unless they acted. Hunger gnawed at them more effectively than the enemy's weapons, and every rationed morsel became a symbol of both survival and desperation. Carthage, another emblematic case, exemplified Rome's iron grip on its adversaries. During the Third Punic War, the Roman legions under Scipio Aemilianus encircled the city with an extraordinary level of organization, cutting off all avenues of escape and supply. Carthaginian soldiers and citizens were trapped in a city that had once been a jewel of commerce and culture, now reduced to a labyrinth of desperation. Romans employed continuous bombardments and a suffocating blockade, leaving the defenders with nothing but their willpower and ingenuity. Stories from contemporary accounts paint harrowing images of survival. Horses slaughtered for meat, hides and leather boiled for sustenance, and, in the darkest moments, reports of cannibalism as men, women, and children struggled against starvation. These extreme measures were born not from choice but necessity, a testament to the severity of Roman siegecraft and the lengths to which human beings would go to endure. Yet, even in the face of unbearable suffering, Carthaginian soldiers held fast to their duty, fully aware that surrender often meant immediate slaughter at the hands of the Romans, who showed no mercy to those who resisted too long or too fiercely. Alesia, the fortified Gaulish stronghold of Vercingetorix. In 52 BCE, Julius Caesar confronted a united Gallic resistance with a meticulous plan that would become legendary. The Romans constructed a double line of fortifications, an inner wall to contain the besieged Gauls, and an outer line to defend against external reinforcements. The defenders faced starvation and dwindling morale, unable to breach the Roman cordon. Caesar's forces controlled access to water and provisions, employing not just brute force, but a meticulous psychological strategy, making the defenders feel their isolation as a constant, inescapable pressure. The Gauls fought valiantly, launching sorties and attempting desperate negotiations, but the Roman grip was unyielding. Hunger became as lethal a weapon as any sword, and the endurance of the soldiers inside the walls was tested to its absolute limit. Some accounts describe men gnawing on horseflesh, boiling the straps and leather of their own equipment for nourishment, and occasionally resorting to cannibalism, a stark reflection of the human instinct to survive when the world outside becomes a cage of death. Rome's approach to siegecraft was revolutionary in its combination of engineering, logistics, and psychological manipulation. Soldiers inside besieged cities were trapped in a calculus of survival, rationing every morsel, guarding every well, and improvising constantly to stave off starvation. Yet even amid suffering, their loyalty and discipline often remained intact. They knew that to surrender was to risk immediate slaughter, and in many cases, this knowledge became the fuel that allowed them to endure far beyond what would have seemed possible. The defenders' ingenuity and persistence were as much a part of the battle as the walls themselves. Secret wells were dug beneath the city, hidden granaries unearthed, and tunnels tunneled to provide access to distant water sources or allow for surreptitious communication with the outside world. Each act of innovation became a small victory. Each day survived a testament to resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The psychological aspect of Roman sieges cannot be overstated. Roman commanders understood that fear and fatigue were as decisive as any weapon. Soldiers outside the walls projected an image of unyielding dominance, maintaining constant visibility, patrolling relentlessly, and signaling that reinforcements were always just out of reach. Inside, every attempt at resistance, every act of defense was overshadowed by the looming certainty of isolation. Hunger and disease compounded the pressure, eroding morale gradually and inexorably by turning the passage of time into an instrument of warfare. The Romans forced defenders into a continuous struggle, not just for life, but for dignity, to maintain cohesion and purpose under circumstances specifically designed to break them. Even in defeat, the legacy of those who endured Roman sieges was remarkable. At Masada, the story of the defenders' final acts, choosing death over surrenders, as a powerful symbol of human resilience and defiance. In Carthage, the remnants of a once great civilization bore witness to the severity of Rome's methods, illustrating the transformative and devastating impact of siege warfare. The endurance of Vercingetorix's soldiers under relentless pressure became a touchstone for military strategists, demonstrating that even in ultimate defeat, the capacity to endure prolonged hardship could shape the narrative of history itself. The Romans also perfected the use of supply and engineering logistics as part of their siege strategy. Roads were built to ensure the army could be provisioned indefinitely. Siege engines constructed in precision, and encampments fortified with the same care as permanent settlements. Time was weaponized. A city could be besieged for months or even years, and as long as the Romans maintained discipline and supply lines, the defenders' endurance would ultimately be tested beyond breaking. Soldiers within the walls, no matter how determined or innovative, faced an enemy whose patience was inexhaustible and whose resources were immense. Every attempt to break the siege from within became a perilous gamble, every sortie fraught with risk. Survival was a daily negotiation with famine and fear, a trial by endurance that few could withstand indefinitely. The human cost of these campaigns was immense. Men and women were pushed to extremes that bordered on the unimaginable, yet their actions were not in vain. Their ingenuity in finding water, their discipline in rationing scarce supplies, and their courage in holding walls against overwhelming odds became defining characteristics of endurance warfare. These soldiers were not only participants in military history, they were the embodiment of resilience under conditions that would have crushed ordinary humans. The stories of boiling leather, scavenging the remains of fallen animals, and the occasional resort to cannibalism underscore the extremity of their struggle, but they also reveal the capacity of the human spirit to adapt, innovate, and persist against relentless adversity. Rome's sieges left an enduring imprint on the art of warfare. The integration of engineering, logistics, and psychological pressure set new standards for how armies would approach besieged cities for centuries. The lessons learned were clear. Patience, planning, and resource management could achieve what brute force alone could not. Soldiers inside the walls were not merely victims of circumstance, but active participants in a contest of endurance, where every decision, whether to ration food, dig a secret well, or launch a desperate sortie, carried life or death consequences. Their struggle transformed the perception of warfare, highlighting the intricate interplay between human will, innovation, and the inexorable passage of time in determining the outcome of conflict. And yet, in the shadow of Rome's iron grip, the defenders' courage remained a quiet, defiant testament to human endurance. They endured hunger, disease, and the constant threat of annihilation, often performing acts of ingenuity and valor that rivaled the military prowess of their besiegers. Even when faced with the inevitability of defeat, their steadfastness shaped the narrative of siege warfare, demonstrating that survival was not solely a matter of material resources, but also of willpower, discipline, and the capacity to endure unimaginable hardship. These stories would echo through history, influencing military strategy, inspiring countless generations, and cementing the Roman legacy, not only as conquerors, but as the architects of one of the most formidable siegecraft systems. The ancient era transformed the landscape of siege warfare, turning the act of defense into an art form as much as a test of endurance. Castles, which had evolved from simple wooden matandabali constructions into towering stone fortresses, became both the home and prison of those who defended them. They were monuments of power, symbols of authority, and, perhaps most importantly, instruments of survival. Unlike the open battlefields of antiquity, medieval warfare often relied on patience, attrition, and psychological endurance. A well-constructed castle was designed not just to repel attackers, but to outlast them, to force a besieging army into a slow, grinding campaign that might last months or even years. The soldiers' role had shifted. They were no longer only warriors, but also caretakers, rationers, engineers, and masters of time itself, tasked with ensuring that the fortress could endure until relief arrived or the enemy gave up. The siege of Rochester in 1215 provides a vivid example of this evolution. During the First Barons' War, Rochester Castle became the focal point of a struggle that pitted rebel barons against King John of England. The castle's walls, high and imposing, were considered nearly impregnable, yet the attackers were patient, methodical, and determined. Soldiers inside the castle had to carefully ration supplies, monitoring every loaf of bread, every jar of water. Rainwater was collected in barrels, and wells within the keep were monitored for both quantity and quality. Every day, defenders faced the dual threats of starvation and disease, the two invisible enemies that were often deadlier than the men massed outside the walls. The siege lasted several weeks, testing not only the physical endurance of those inside, but also their mental fortitude. Soldiers rotated duties carefully to preserve energy, alternating between manning the walls, digging defensive trenches, and tending to the meager gardens that had been planted within the castle courtyard. Seiges Galliard, constructed by Richard the Lionheart in the late 12th century, represented the pinnacle of medieval fortification and strategy. Perched high above the river Seine, it was designed to resist both attack and prolonged siege. When Philip II of France laid siege to the fortress in 1203 to 1204, the defenders relied on ingenious methods to stretch their supplies. Rooftop gardens provided some sustenance, while secret tunnels allowed messengers to slip through enemy lines to coordinate with allies outside. Soldiers foraged wherever possible, turning unused storage areas, attics, and even battlements into sources of food. Pigeons were used to carry messages, ensuring communication with external forces despite the encirclement. These strategies were not merely clever, they were essential for survival. Every innovation, every adaptation was a response to the inexorable passage of time that the attackers were weaponizing against them. Yet, even the most sophisticated fortresses could not entirely neutralize the effects of famine and disease. In medieval sieges, starvation was gradual but merciless, sapping strength, morale, and the will to fight. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary confines of the castle, often claiming more lives than enemy swords. Dysentery, scurvy, and typhus were constant threats, exacerbated by poor ventilation, contaminated water, and the stress of confinement. Soldiers learned to cope with these invisible adversaries through discipline and ingenuity. They developed systems for rationing food, boiling water, and isolating the sick. But the relentless advance of hunger and illness was always a pressing concern. Siege warfare in this era was as much a contest of human endurance and medical improvisation as it was of walls and weaponry. The design of castles reflected this understanding of siege survival. Thick stone walls, narrow entrances, and elevated towers were complemented by carefully planned storage areas, cisterns for water, and hidden passages for emergency escape or clandestine resupply. Castles were microcosms of resilience, engineered to resist both the force of arms and the slow attrition of time. Soldiers became experts in multitasking. They were not only defenders, but also gardeners, engineers, and logistics officers, managing the flow of resources with precision. Every decision had profound consequences. A single misjudgment in rationing or resource allocation could lead to famine, mutiny, or collapse. Medieval sieges also involved a constant psychological struggle. Defenders had to maintain morale amid Relentless attacks, often facing months of isolation from the outside world. Leaders within the castle were tasked with sustaining hope, enforcing discipline, and maintaining unity, knowing that any breakdown in order could prove fatal. Stories from various sieges recount moments of ingenuity and courage, from soldiers rappelling down walls to gather supplies from enemy lines, to the use of trebuchets and countermines to disrupt besieging forces. These actions, while tactical, were also acts of resilience, demonstrating the indomitable will of those who endured prolonged confinement under the shadow of overwhelming threat. In addition to the physical defenses, communication and intelligence became vital tools of survival. Pigeons, messengers, and signals ensured that castles remained connected to allies and reinforcements outside the enemy lines. Knowledge of the surrounding terrain, enemy movements, and supply routes was meticulously gathered and analyzed, allowing defenders to plan sorties, ration food efficiently, and anticipate potential breaches. Soldiers had to act as both warriors and strategists, balancing the immediate needs of combat with the long-term necessity of survival. Every decision carried weight, for a misstep could accelerate famine, spread disease, or compromise the structural integrity of the fortress itself. The siege of Rochester and Chateau Lord also highlighted the importance of community and shared responsibility within the castle walls. Nobles, soldiers, and civilians alike were drawn into the struggle for survival, each contributing to the collective effort in ways that went far beyond traditional military roles. Women and children assisted in food preparation, water collection, and medical care, while artisans and laborers repaired walls, maintained weapons, and produced essential supplies. The siege became a societal crucible, testing not only martial skill but the capacity of an entire community to endure under extreme stress. It was a vivid demonstration that survival in a medieval siege required coordination, discipline, and ingenuity at every level. Despite these measures, the grim reality remained. No matter how thick the walls or how clever the survival strategies, famine and disease were relentless. Chroniclers of the period frequently described the horrors within besieged castlesmen eating horses, boiling leather, or consuming otherwise inedible materials to stay alive. Some accounts even recount episodes of cannibalism, extreme though they may have been, illustrating the sheer desperation that long-term siege conditions could produce. These stories, though harrowing, serve as testimony to the extraordinary resilience of those who endured them, highlighting the extreme lengths to which humans would go to survive. When trapped between stone walls and the unyielding passage of time. Yet, even amid suffering, defenders found ways to assert agency. Secret tunnels allowed for limited sorties, enabling soldiers to gather intelligence, attack enemy supply lines, or communicate with allies. Water cisterns, hidden wells, and cleverly designed storage areas became lifelines, while the construction of rooftop gardens and small-scale cultivation demonstrated remarkable innovation in the face of scarcity. Soldiers were constantly engaged in problem-solving, adapting to circumstances that might have broken ordinary men, and in doing so, they maintained not just life but hope. Each small triumph, stretching a grain ration, repairing a collapsed wall, or successfully signaling to the outside world, became a critical victory in the broader struggle for survival. The endurance demanded by medieval sieges extended beyond the physical and logistical. Psychological resilience was paramount, as defenders were forced to endure not just the immediate threat of enemy assault, but also the creeping despair of prolonged isolation. Months could pass with little or no direct combat, yet every day was a battle against hunger, disease, and fatigue. Leaders within the castle had to inspire courage, enforce discipline, and prevent despair from fracturing the community. Tales from these sieges often recount moments of remarkable fortitude, where individuals undertook near-suicidal acts to procure food or defend weakened sections of the wall, demonstrating that survival was as much a matter of mental strength as it was of physical endurance. The architecture of castles reflected this dual focus on defense and endurance. Towers, keeps, and curtain walls were complemented by strategically placed granaries, wells, and cisterns, all designed to maximize the castle's capacity to withstand prolonged isolation. Soldiers adapted to these conditions by taking on multiple roles, from rationing and resource management to maintenance of defensive structures and cultivation of small gardens. Every element of castle life was oriented toward survival under siege, creating a delicate balance in which discipline, ingenuity, and endurance intersected. Even the smallest innovations could prove decisive. Rooftop gardens provided fresh greens and herbs, mitigating nutritional deficiencies. Pigeons and messenger systems maintained critical communication lines. Hidden tunnels allowed for occasional escape, a protracted and brutal conflict between England and France that stretched from 1337 to 1453 transformed the landscape of European warfare, revealing the immense capacity for human endurance under siege conditions. Unlike the swift campaigns of earlier centuries, this war was characterized by long-term attrition, the constant movement of armies across vast territories, and, most devastatingly for those trapped within cities, protracted sieges that could last months or even years. For soldiers stationed behind city walls, survival was a daily struggle against not only the enemy's weapons, but the merciless passage of time. Freezing winters, scorching summers, and the insidious spread of disease. The soldiers who endured these conditions were forced to confront the fragility of life, the limits of morale, and the unyielding reality that, in war, survival itself could become a victory. Orleans, perhaps the most celebrated siege of the 100 Years' War, epitomized the extremes of endurance that defined this era. In 1428, the city came under relentless attack by English forces seeking to consolidate their hold on northern France. Orleans was a city fortified by walls and natural barriers, yet its defenders faced a seemingly insurmountable challenge: a besieging army that controlled the surrounding countryside, cut off supply lines, and slowly tightened its grip with a precision born of experience. Soldiers stationed on the ramparts endured freezing winter nights, huddling together for warmth, and day after day they faced relentless bombardment and sorties by the enemy. Each day, without supplies or reinforcements, was a battle of will, as hunger gnawed at the body and despair threatened the mind. Civilians within the city shared in the suffering, and tensions often erupted when food became scarce, and soldiers, tasked with both defense and rationing, were forced to consume supplies that might otherwise have sustained the broader population. The social fabric of the city was tested almost as severely as its walls. Calais, another emblematic siege, demonstrated the interplay of patience, strategy, and endurance on both sides of the conflict. The French held Port City with a meticulously planned blockade. Soldiers within the walls struggled to maintain morale as weeks turned into months and months stretched into a year. Food grew increasingly scarce, water became contaminated, and disease spread with alarming speed, claiming lives faster than enemy arrows. Civilians, trapped alongside soldiers, were forced to confront the reality that survival often required desperate measures. Accounts from the siege recount moments of bitter confrontation between the military and civilian populations, as every morsel of food became contested, every ration a lifeline, and every decision a potential spark for mutiny or collapse. Yet, despite these pressures, soldiers remained vigilant, understanding that surrender would likely bring massacre, deportation, or the humiliation of defeat. Endurance, discipline, and unwavering attention to the management of resources became as critical to survival as martial skill. The siege of Harfleur in 1415 further illustrates the relentless pressures endured by soldiers and civilians alike. When Henry V of England launched his campaign in northern France, the fortified port town became a critical target, both strategically and psychologically. Soldiers faced extreme conditions, exposed to the shifting moods of weather, from freezing rains to sweltering heat, which compounded the effects of dwindling supplies. The city's defenders improvised wherever possible. Rooftop gardens were cultivated to provide minimal sustenance. Secret wells and cisterns were dug or reinforced to secure water, and messengers risked death to maintain contact with potential reinforcements. Yet even these innovations were insufficient to fully mitigate the hardships imposed by a prolonged siege. Starvation, illness, and fatigue gnawed at every layer of the population, while the constant threat of attack demanded unrelenting vigilance. In this environment, the endurance of soldiers became not only a measure of physical strength, but a testament to the capacity of human will to persevere under extreme stress. Soldiers and civilians alike were forced to confront the monotony of waiting, the uncertainty of outcome, and the slow erosion of hope. The passage of time itself became a weapon wielded by the besiegers, who understood that patience, persistence, and the ability to maintain supply lines often mattered more than direct assault. Soldiers developed routines to maintain morale, alternating duties on the walls, in the armories, and within makeshift kitchens and infirmaries. Leaders were required not only to organize defenses, but to sustain the cohesion and morale of their men, balancing harsh discipline with the encouragement necessary to prevent despair from taking hold. Even minor successes, a captured messenger, a fresh water source, a small cache of grain, were magnified into moments of morale and psychological relief, offering soldiers a glimpse of hope in otherwise relentless conditions. Yet the social dynamics within besieged cities could be as deadly as the enemy outside. Civilians, trapped with soldiers and reliant on shared resources, sometimes turned on the very defenders whose efforts kept them alive. Accusations of hoarding, theft, or preferential rationing could erupt into violence, adding an internal strain to the already extreme pressures of siege life. Soldiers were often caught in the impossible position of balancing the needs of the military defense with the survival of civilians, and missteps could lead to unrest, mutiny, or the weakening of defensive cohesion. These pressures tested not only the individual endurance of soldiers, but the capacity of leadership to maintain unity under conditions of extreme stress. In Orleans, the arrival of Joan of Arc in 1429 transformed the siege from a test of survival into a turning point of the war. Her leadership galvanized the defenders, infusing them with a renewed sense of purpose and courage. Soldiers, previously reduced to mere endurance, were inspired to acts of extraordinary valor. The combination of tactical skill, strategic reinforcement, and the psychological impact of her presence allowed the city to withstand the English siege and eventually lift the blockade. The Siege of Orleans demonstrated that endurance could shape the destiny of nations. The capacity of soldiers and citizens to survive months of deprivation and maintain discipline and resolve became a decisive factor in the broader conflict. It underscored the principle that survival under siege was not simply a passive act of waiting, but an active struggle requiring resilience, ingenuity, and unwavering commitment to a cause greater than oneself. The sieges of the 100 Years' War also illustrate the interplay between environment, strategy, and human endurance. Soldiers contended with both natural and human-made adversities, harsh winters and sweltering summers, limited access to fresh water and nutrition, and the constant pressure of enemy artillery, including primitive cannons and trebuchets. Disease spread rapidly in crowded, poorly ventilated quarters, while morale ebbed and flowed with the availability of food, reinforcements, and news from the broader theater of war. Each factor had cascading effects. A failed harvest within the city could precipitate rationing crises, leading to conflict among defenders and civilians alike. Conversely, the successful management of resources, water, and communication networks could extend the endurance of the population long enough to outlast the besiegers. Strategically, these prolonged sieges reshaped the nature of warfare itself. Armies could no longer rely solely on battlefield victories to secure political objectives. Endurance, attrition, and control of fortified positions became equally decisive. Commanders understood that time could be leveraged as a weapon, forcing defenders into desperate calculations and sometimes compelling surrender without a direct assault. Soldiers within besieged cities were constantly engaged in this multidimensional struggle, balancing immediate survival with the overarching strategic needs of their lords and monarchs. The endurance required was holistic, encompassing physical stamina, mental resilience, tactical acumen, and social cohesion. Throughout the 100 Years' War, the pattern was consistent. Cities under siege became microcosms of human endurance, where soldiers and civilians alike confronted the extremes of hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty. While some succumbed to disease, despair, or internal conflict, others adapted and innovated, cultivating food, securing water, fortifying walls, and maintaining morale against the odds. Victories such as the relief of Orleans demonstrated the profound impact that endurance could have on the course of history, proving that the capacity to withstand prolonged deprivation and maintain cohesive defense could alter the trajectory of kingdoms and empires. Even when sieges ended in defeat, the stories of endurance resonated through history. Soldiers who survived became exemplars of resilience, their experiences informing subsequent generations of commanders and chroniclers. The lessons of these sieges, rationing, innovation, psychological fortitude, and the integration of civilians into the defense would influence European military strategy for centuries. They demonstrated that endurance under siege was not a passive act, but an active, complex struggle requiring skill, discipline, and a relentless gunpowder in Europe and the Near East did not end the era of siege warfare. It transformed it into a far more brutal, mechanical, and psychologically taxing endeavor. For centuries, stone walls had been a city's ultimate defense, capable of withstanding battering rams, catapults, and scaling ladders. Soldiers stationed behind these fortifications had developed a rhythm of endurance, rationing food, digging wells, maintaining morale, and repairing walls day after day. But with the introduction of cannons, the calculus of defense shifted dramatically. Refused to yield easily. The human will to endure, to resist not only the enemy, but also the passage of time, hunger, and fear, became more essential than ever. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 stands as the emblematic turning point of this era. The once mighty Byzantine capital, a jewel of the medieval world, faced the unstoppable advance of the Ottoman Empire under Mehmed II. Massive cannons, some reportedly over 20 feet in length, pounded the city's walls day and night. These weapons, engineering marvels of their age, shattered sections of the once impenetrable Theodosian walls, sending shockwaves through the defenders' ranks. Soldiers stationed along the battlements fought until their last breath, manning artillery, repairing breaches, and maintaining their posts despite the deafening roar of cannon fire. Hunger gnawed at them. Water was rationed with extreme care, and disease spread rapidly through crowded quarters, yet they refused to abandon the city. The human spirit was tested against metal and fire, proving that even as technology evolved, endurance remained at the core of survival. During this period, starvation was no longer only a product of encirclement, but also a deliberate instrument of psychological warfare. Cannons shortened the time frame of destruction, but did not guarantee immediate victory. Besiegers often combined bombardment with blockades, cutting off trade, destroying crops, and isolating the city entirely. Soldiers inside were forced to adapt, stretching every ration, cultivating whatever could be grown in confined spaces, and scavenging materials from ruins to sustain life. The siege of Constantinople exemplified this dual pressure. As the walls crumbled physically, the defenders also faced the invisible but lethal forces of hunger, disease, and despair. In the Renaissance, endurance under siege assumed an additional, almost ideological weight. Cities such as Vienna in 1529 faced overwhelming Ottoman forces, and soldiers inside starved not only to survive, but to preserve national honor. Vienna's defenders understood that surrender was not merely a military failure, but a blow to the identity and prestige of their kingdom. Supplies dwindled dangerously. Winters were harsh, and disease swept through the population. Yet the defenders held firm. Even small successes, repelling a sally, conserving a barrel of grain, repairing a breach, were celebrated, as each day survived was a testament to human resilience and commitment to a higher cause. Technology. transformed tactics, but did not erase the human element. Soldiers now contended with walls breached by cannon fire, artillery that shook foundations, and attackers whose patience was matched only by their mechanical ingenuity. Yet the response of defenders remained fundamentally the same: adapt, ration, improvise, and endure. Rooftop gardens, hidden wells, and secret tunnels remained vital tools for survival, and ingenuity often determined whether a city fell quickly or held out for months. Starvation, once a slow and deliberate tool of classical siegecraft, became entwined with the immediate terror of artillery, creating a psychological crucible that tested mental fortitude as harshly as physical endurance. Constantinople's fall in 1453 demonstrated the limits of endurance in the face of overwhelming technological and numerical superiority. The city's soldiers had performed extraordinary feats of defense. Human will, marking the end of the Byzantine Empire and illustrating a new reality in the age of gunpowder. Endurance was heroic, but not always sufficient. Soldiers still fought and survived as long as they could, embodying courage against impossible odds. But the nature of siegecraft had irrevocably changed. The siege of Vienna in 1529, however, offered a contrasting narrative. Here, endurance became a strategic tool that reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Soldiers, engineers, and civilians alike participated in a coordinated effort to stretch supplies, fortify positions, and repel an overwhelming force. Every rationed meal, every repaired wall, every vigilant watch at night contributed to a collective act of resilience and coordinated effort. Throughout this period, the lessons for soldiers under siege were clear. Cannons could shatter walls, but they could not immediately break the spirit. Hunger, cold, disease, and fatigue remained the true long-term adversaries. Soldiers developed detailed routines to maintain strength and morale, from shared rationing systems to rotational guard duties and clandestine foraging. Survival depended on cooperation, careful planning, and an unwavering commitment to duty. Siege warfare had evolved into a multidimensional contest where mechanical destruction and human endurance intersected, producing conditions that were more physically and psychologically taxing than any prior era. Even as artillery reshaped siegecraft, the human narrative of survival endured. Stories of soldiers defending Constantinople and Vienna highlight extraordinary acts of ingenuity, reinforcing breached walls with rubble and timber, digging emergency wells under fire, maintaining communication through signal systems, and rationing supplies with meticulous care. The soldiers who survived these sieges exemplified courage, discipline, and innovation, proving that endurance remained at the heart of military strategy. The lessons of this era would resonate for centuries, influencing tactics, fortification, design, and military thought well into the modern period. In essence, the age of gunpowder did not eliminate the need for endurance, it intensified it. Soldiers faced faster destruction, harsher conditions, and more immediate threats. They became engineers, rationers, and innovators, confronting hunger, disease, and despair with the same resourcefulness that had allowed defenders to survive classical and medieval sieges, and courage against a new and terrifying form and 18th centuries. Siege warfare had entered an era of almost scientific precision. Engineers such as Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban in France transformed the practice into a near clockwork operation, designing fortifications and orchestrating attacks with exacting calculations of angles, artillery placement, and supply lines. Yet, despite this mechanization, the human cost remained as severe as ever. Soldiers, trapped within fortified cities, faced familiar adversaries: starvation, disease, exposure, and the psychological strain of watching months or even years pass without reprieve. The clockwork precision of early modern sieges intensified, rather than alleviated, the suffering of those inside the 30 Years' War. 1618 to 1648 provides a chilling illustration. Cities across the Holy Roman Empire were subjected to prolonged blockades, where defenders endured freezing winters and stifling summers while attempting to maintain morale and organize dwindling supplies. Food became increasingly scarce, and the crowded conditions fostered the rapid spread of dysentery, typhus, and other epidemics. Soldiers were forced to forage, scavenge, and, at times, subsist on the most meager and unsavory rations imaginable. Even with precise engineering from besieging forces, the slow march of time inside the walls became the most formidable enemy. Stalemates dragged on for months, and the human body, tested repeatedly by hunger, exposure, and disease, often failed long before walls were breached. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, echoed similar patterns. During prolonged sieges, soldiers and civilians alike were caught in a relentless struggle for survival. Urban centers became microcosms of human endurance, with fortifications transformed into living laboratories of rationing, ingenuity, and psychological resilience. Civilians sometimes turned on soldiers, resenting their consumption of limited provisions, while soldiers themselves had to balance the defense of the city with maintaining cohesion and morale among the populace. Secret wells, hidden storage caches, and rooftop gardens became essential survival tools, while coordinated patrols and nightly watches preserved order in the face of external and internal threats. Despite the mechanization of siegecraft, human ingenuity remained critical. Soldiers developed intricate systems to extend the life of supplies, including rotating rations, preserving grains and meats, and scavenging refuse that might otherwise have been discarded. Discipline became paramount. Only by strict adherence to routines and careful management of resources could a city survive extended encirclement. Yet even the most disciplined garrisons were not immune to mutiny or breakdowns in order. Hunger and fatigue created tension between soldiers and civilians, sometimes erupting into violent conflict that undermined the very defenses the soldiers sought to protect. Early modern sieges were exercises in both endurance and strategy. Engineers, like Vauban, revolutionized the art, constructing star forts, angled bastions, and layered defensive works designed to withstand bombardment while facilitating prolonged defense. Besiegers employed precise artillery placement, sapping operations, and systematic blockades, turning time into a weapon to starve, exhaust, and demoralize defenders. Within the walls, soldiers had to counter not just the mechanical threat of siege engines, but the insidious effects of isolation, hunger, and disease. Each decision how to ration food, when to repair walls, how to maintain morale carried life or death consequences. In many cases, survival depended on adapting to conditions imposed by both technology and circumstance. Soldiers scavenged from ruins, cultivated what could grow in confined spaces, and organized water collection systems. They maintained guard rotations, repaired walls under fire, and monitored the health of their comrades. The endurance required in early modern sieges was multidimensional: physical stamina, ingenuity, mental resilience, and the capacity to manage social dynamics were all tested, and 20th centuries unfolded. The age-old trials of siege warfare did not vanish, they merely transformed under the pressures of industrialization, modern weaponry, and total war. Soldiers defending cities like Sevastopol during the Crimean War, Parisians in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian conflict, and the citizens and defenders of Leningrad during the Second World War found themselves trapped between the relentless weight of enemy encirclement and the gnawing scarcity of sustenance. Despite advances in artillery, explosives, and logistics, the core human challenge remained unchanged: to endure, to survive, and to resist the slow, insidious force of hunger and despair. These sieges were brutal crucibles, testing endurance, not for days or months, but often for years, pushing men and women to extremes of ingenuity, courage, and desperation. The Siege of Sevastopol from 1854 to 1855 exemplified this modern iteration of endurance warfare. Russian defenders faced a coalition of French, British, and Ottoman forces equipped with rifled artillery and explosive shells, weapons capable of reducing fortifications to rubble in hours rather than days. Yet the human response mirrored patterns established millennia before. Soldiers dug trenches, reinforced crumbling walls, and rationed food with obsessive care. Accounts of the siege reveal men surviving on meager portions, supplementing with whatever foraged from surrounding areas, or salvaged from destroyed buildings. Discipline and morale were constantly tested. Frostbitten extremities, disease, and exhaustion were as much enemies as cannon fire. Yet soldiers endured, their resolve as formidable as the walls they defended. Every day survived was both a tactical and moral victory, a testament to the capacity of human will under extreme duress. The Siege of Paris in 1870 introduced new dimensions to endurance. Prussian forces encircled the city during the Franco-Prussian War, cutting off supplies and leaving civilians and soldiers alike in desperate circumstances. Food became an obsession, with accounts noting the consumption of horses, dogs, and, in the most extreme cases, glue and other inedible substances transformed into sustenance. Yet even amid such deprivation, the defenders maintained discipline and ingenuity. Communal kitchens, rationing committees, and coordinated water and fuel collection became essential for survival. Soldiers and civilians alike became participants in a collective struggle, each action a contribution to the broader effort of holding out against a technologically superior and numerically imposing force. The endurance of these men and women became a form of civic heroism, enshrining survival as a moral as well as military triumph. The Siege of Leningrad during the Second World War elevated the concept of endurance to staggering heights. From September 1941 to January 1944, the city was encircled by German and Finnish forces. leaving over 2 million civilians and soldiers trapped behind fortified perimeters in freezing winters and sweltering summers. Food was reduced to rations, barely sufficient to sustain life, often made from flour mixed with sawdust or other inedible fillers. Animals, pets, and even glue were consumed to stave off starvation. Disease, cold, and exhaustion became daily companions. Yet the city did not fall, in part because of the extraordinary resilience of its defenders. Soldiers who rotated duties on the walls, maintained communication with relief forces, and improvised wherever possible to preserve life. The endurance displayed here was not only physical but profoundly psychological. As soldiers balanced the maintenance of morale with the brutal realities of hunger, death, and the constant presence of enemy artillery and air bombardment across these modern sieges, a recurring pattern emerges. Survival was never passive. It demanded creativity, discipline, and communal cooperation. Soldiers became engineers, rationers, and organizers, often improvising technologies and strategies to counter the devastating effects of encirclement. Trenches were dug not just to repel attacks, but to protect scarce food and water supplies. Makeshift gardens, hidden storage caches, and scavenging operations became lifelines. The passage of time itself was weaponized, both by the besiegers to exhaust defenders and by the defenders as a measure of their endurance. Each day survived carried strategic significance, gradually wearing down the attacker's patience, while simultaneously testing the limits of human endurance. The modern era also amplified the psychological and symbolic dimensions of endurance. Soldiers were not only fighting for survival or strategic advantage, they were fighting to uphold morale, national pride, and historical memory. The defenders of Sevastopol, Paris, and Leningrad understood that their perseverance was a statement, a living testament to human resolve in the face of overwhelming adversity. To endure a siege was to become part of a narrative larger than oneself, to join the ranks of countless soldiers throughout history whose names may never be remembered individually, but whose collective heroism shaped the destinies of nations. Hunger, fear, and death became instruments of both punishment and pride, and every small triumphal loaf of bread saved, a trench reinforced, a breach repaired was magnified in significance. Despite technological advances, the essential elements of siege warfare remained timeless. Starvation continued to be the deadliest weapon, often more lethal than any gun or cannon. Disease and cold were constant threats, exacerbated by the confinement and scarcity imposed by encirclement. Soldiers were forced to ration supplies, improvise sustenance, and maintain morale under conditions that would have broken lesser individuals. The act of survival itself became heroic, a quiet testament to the capacity of human beings to endure extremes of deprivation, fear, and uncertainty. In each of these sieges, soldiers became living myths. Their endurance transcended the immediate context of war, creating a legacy that would echo through history. Accounts of men eating unconventional foods to stave off starvation, digging, scavenging, and defending their positions under continuous bombardment became emblematic of the human spirit's capacity to resist annihilation. Even when cities eventually fell, the memory of those who survived through ingenuity, courage, and sheer willpower remained a testament to resilience. They demonstrated that walls could hold against the enemy. Flesh could endure the gnawing pressures of hunger, and willpower could defy the slow, inevitable passage of time. From ancient Troy to Leningrad, the arc of siege warfare demonstrates a constant truth. Hunger was the deadliest weapon, patience a key ally, and human endurance the deciding factor between collapse and survival. Soldiers who endured year-long sieges were not merely defending territory, they were embodying the timeless struggle of humanity against scarcity, fear, and the inexorable forces of both nature and war. Each siege, whether medieval or modern, reflects the same fundamental narrative: the triumph of the human spirit under conditions designed to break it, and the recognition that survival itself can be a defining victory, even against insurmountable odds. The final great sieges of modern history also underscore the evolution of warfare while reinforcing its constants. Cannons, rifled artillery, and aerial bombardments changed the scale and mechanics of destruction. Yet, the daily struggle for survival remained fundamentally unchanged. Soldiers rationed, scavenged, repaired, and endured, their experiences echoing those of their ancient and medieval counterparts. In this continuity, the enduring human story becomes clear. The tools of war may change, but the test of human resilience, the ability to survive, when the world outside the walls seems determined to destroy you, remains eternal in this way. The last great year-long sieges serve as both a continuation and culmination of a story that spans millennia. Soldiers who endured in Sevastopol, Paris, and Leningrad were heirs to the strategies, ingenuity, and sheer stubbornness of defenders from Troy, Constantinople, and Orleans. They carried forward the same principles of rationing, engineering, morale maintenance, and improvisation, adapting these timeless strategies to the demands of modern weaponry and urban environments. Their sacrifices and endurance stand as the final chapter in the epic history of year-long sieges, revealing not only the horrors of war, but also the enduring capacity of humans to resist, adapt, and survive against impossible odds year-long. Sieges reveal the rawest truths about soldiers. Courage was not always measured by the charge into battle, but by the quiet, unyielding struggle to endure, to survive, and to resist the slow, grinding pressures of hunger, disease, and despair. From the walls of Troy to the frozen streets of Leningrad, men and women endured unimaginable hardships, proving that human endurance could shape the fate of cities, kingdoms, and empires alike. The defenders of Orleans, Constantinople, Sevastopol, Paris, and Leningrad all shared this defining trait. They transformed suffering into resistance, scarcity into ingenuity, and fear into the relentless will to survive. From glory to ruin, the story of these soldiers underscores that survival itself can be a decisive act. Castles crumbled, walls fell, and cities were eventually captured. Yet the endurance of those who held out created legacies that transcended time. Soldiers became symbols, their trials remembered not for the walls they defended alone, but for the human spirit embodied in each ration stretched, each trench dug, and each day survived against seemingly insurmountable odds.